overbearing governments. Governments want to make sure that no one can get beyond their reach. And the U.S. government even enforces tax obligations on people who renounce their citizenship and leave the country. They track them down to the ends of the earth and try to extract money from them. So governments are increasingly cartelizing among themselves, harmonizing their regulations, and every time regulations are harmonized, they don't simply all move to about the middle point in the regulatory spectrum. They bring everybody up to the severest form of regulation. You see this in the European Union in egregious forms. Regulations in the EU are in many cases even more horrifying than regulations in the United States, because the EU, in effect, it has harmonized regulations across all its member countries, or is in the process of doing so. We need to have international competition in a world with governments so that people will have a refuge, people will have a place to go. This is the lesson of what we call in this country federalism. We once had much more powerful state governments in this country relative to the federal government. And the virtue of a federal system is that it gives people a place to run to go away from the more overbearing, high-taxing, outrageously regulating governments. And we still see this to some extent in this country, but one of the moves that has accompanied the growth of government in the United States is the progressive weakening of federalism. And I hold no brief for state governments. State and local governments can also be quite tyrannical. But the beauty of having a lot of these little tyrannies is that we can run away from them. And to some extent that puts pressure on them to lighten up on their tyrannical actions. So it's imperative that we not move to a single government that embraces everybody. This would be the worst, most horrifying fate for humanity.
Alpine, California, you're on with Robert Higgs. Please go ahead.
Hi, Robert Higgs. Thank you so much for taking my call. I once was on welfare, and my father basically embarrassed me enough that I got off welfare and am making it in the world. I've worked for state governments and federal governments, and I work for the, what you call the economic capitalism group now, and free markets. But my husband would love to hear from you. He's on the road today, and he has one question. I told him about you on the air, and he said, how do we stop this? Do we need to start and do another revolution?
How do we stop this is a seemingly simple question. If I had a simple answer, I would give it to you straight away. This is a situation that developed over a long period of time, more than a century, for a variety of reasons. It's the product of a complex historical process. It didn't come into being in a simple way, and there's no simple way to remedy the evils that we find ourselves immersed in today as a result of having big, overbearing, tyrannical or quasi-tyrannical government. But I do believe that the first step that has to be taken is to increase public understanding of the situation in which we find ourselves, how we got here, and what measures might be taken to move us in the opposite direction. At present, we are moving further toward big, abusive, expensive, unaffordable, overbearing government. And we're doing this not simply here, but we're doing this on a very wide international scale, as we've just seen with the G20 meeting that concluded recently. The governments are attempting to cartelize. They call it cooperation. They paint a pretty face on it, but every time they take these measures, they remove another refuge for people who are attempting to escape from tyranny. And what we can do is try to improve our own understanding of how the world works, and then support measures to rescind, to appeal, to cut back, to go in the opposite direction. We'll always be told that we can't go in the opposite direction, that we can't turn the clock back. But we can turn the clock back. Tyranny was worse under Stalin than it is in Russia today. They turned the clock back. Tyranny was worse in Germany under Hitler than it is in Germany today. They turned the clock back. We can turn the clock back too, but we have to have a commitment to do so. We have to have enough people who understand why the world is in the shape it's in, how it got there, and what measures will get it out of that situation. Until we have wider public understanding, our quest is really hopeless, because people will always be taken in by propaganda and by the arguments of people who hope to use government power in the service of their own interest group objectives. Sure, they think, well, if I don't use this power, somebody else is going to grab it and use it for purposes that hurt me. So I'd better grab it before somebody else does. This never works. In the long run, it only increases the growth of government power until we find that there's really only one effective government interest group left standing at the end of the day, and that's the government itself. We've seen this happen in other places. We can't say it can't happen here. It can happen here, and unfortunately, it has to a substantial extent already happened here.
Has there been a time in American history where we have rolled back, as you say?
Yes, the early 19th century saw considerable rollbacks, and there were also short-term rollbacks after some of the major wars. After the Civil War, there was considerable rollback of government power, and government didn't grow very fast for the next 30 or 40 years, although it began to accelerate in the late 19th and early 20th century. But certainly some aspects that were most horrifying, such as slavery, were abolished. So to think that we're caught in some kind of wheel of history that can only roll in one direction is a great mistake. That wheel can be rolled in any direction that we choose to move it, but we can't move it as single individuals. We have to have more people who understand the wheel, what it's crushing underneath its weight, and how to turn it back.
Jamaica, New York.
Earlier in the show, you were very unhappy with government programs, bailouts, etc. You're willing to let corporations go their own way. And generally speaking, the government believes that it's just going to exacerbate the problem. Fewer jobs, fewer purchases. If they don't do anything, what's the economic mechanism that's going to reverse the situation, that's going to right the economic ship? Thank you.
If the government would remove itself from these bailouts and stimulus packages and all the rest of it, and let market forces operate, what we would see is that firms that have become insolvent would have to go through bankruptcy